For those of us in the message, the Prophet's Tabernacle was a sacred place. People from all parts of the world came to visit the Prophet's church in Jeffersonville, Indiana. The Prophet told my grandfather that the angels lined the walls of that building, and I believed it. Many brothers and sisters say that they felt a very special presence when they were in the Branham Tabernacle. Growing up in the message, I felt it too. To the locals, it's just the church with the sword above the door. On the front of the Branham Tabernacle, just above the two glass entry doors, an eagle was attached to the outside of the building with its wings spread and a sword in its talons. This, as you can imagine, was problematic for a city with such a high rate of crime. The weapon was frequently stolen. After disappearing, however, another was quickly put into its place. I have no doubt that the many citizens of Jeffersonville looked at the building with one raised eyebrow, trying to imagine what must go on behind those closed doors. But to us, the Branham Tabernacle was much, much more than just simply the church with a weapon above the door. It was the church where William Branham buried the prophecies in the cornerstone. One of the most important features of the Branham Tabernacle was found on the right-hand side of the building facing south. Approaching the building from the south was a parking lot just large enough for 2 rows of cars parked bumper to bumper. Parking spaces were separated from the building by the sidewalk. After any service, as the congregation poured out of the side doors and the sidewalk quickly filled with people who stood talking, sometimes for hours, those who arrived early could not leave. Their vehicles were blocked by those who arrived after them. To signal their desire to leave, the early birds stood outside their vehicles with the driver's door open, Bible on top of the car, and arms folded comfortably above the door. Beyond all of this, just at the front corner of the red brick building, was a light gray concrete block with the inscription, "Dedicated in 1933." This block was significant. The year 1933 was important to the message. The block itself was nothing fancy, just a simple time marker, barely high enough to be noticed as visitors walked down the sidewalk towards the front entrance of the building. To the casual observer, especially those without interest in the history of the message, it might have been overlooked. For us, however, this was the most important part of the building. 1933 was the year that it all started. 1933 was the year that God made himself known to the people of Jeffersonville. How could they have forgotten? It was beyond my understanding how such an incredible series of events could be lost to time. The prophet said that in 1933, as he was baptizing hundreds of people in the Ohio River, as 10,000 people watched the service, a shining star came down from the heavens just over the prophet's head. A voice from the heavens spoke, announcing the prophet and the importance of his ministry. God wanted the people of Jeffersonville to hear his prophet, and with his own voice, he told them so. 1933 was also the year of the prophecies. As the prophet was walking to church, he had a vision of the events soon to come. He saw how the French would build a concrete line of fortification to block the soon-to-come invasion by Germany. He saw that President Roosevelt would take the United States into war, and he saw how the fascist leader Benito Mussolini would come to an end. He saw that cars would become more and more egg-shaped, while the women became more and more immoral. Eventually, the United States would elect a female president, and she would cause the destruction of the United States. According to my grandfather, the prophet buried this list of prophecies in the ground beneath the 1933 marker of the Branham Tabernacle. It was not kept there for future generations, for one of those prophecies described America smoldering in ashes, and the prophet described the hydrogen bomb that was aimed at Jeffersonville. The prophecies were buried, never again to be seen, and he and his family were the only ones to have seen the paper before it was buried. Nevertheless, this unseen paper was proof that he was a prophet. Myself, I needed no proof. I believed in the unseen. Just like the prophet often told us, look to the unseen. When I thought about the Branham Tabernacle, I thought about the red brick building. I never really thought about what it originally looked like or the history behind its establishment. I will never forget my surprise when I saw old photographs of the church as it first looked in the 1930s. The red brick shell around the building was added much later, as was the concrete inset describing its 1933 dedication. One of the photographs had a pentagram above the door, which was later replaced with an eagle. I will also never forget my surprise when another message brother and sister found the deed to the building that I knew as the Branham Tabernacle. At that time, the church carried the name Billie Branham Pentecostal Tabernacle. Seeing the date of the document, November 9, 1936, raised many questions. The church was a fundamental part of the beginning of the message. We had pictures of the church's 1933 dedication, just as the building was dated. At first I thought, maybe the prophet used the church from 1933 and purchased it later. But I couldn't explain the name of the building. The prophet claimed that he was a Baptist minister and refused to heed the Pentecostal call at the request of his mother-in-law until 1937. The deed to the church simply did not match the background story that we had heard in so many sermons. I knew it was time to dig deeper into the early years of the prophet's ministry. When Roy Davis and his brothers came to Jeffersonville, they caused quite a commotion. Not only was Davis at the center of criminal and civil lawsuits, he had started a public religious war against Prohibition using the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper as his media platform. Those who would have loved to hate Davis for his immoral lifestyle with underage women would have hesitated to say so in a community that could have been thriving during the Great Depression. Davis alleged, at that time, that he was against Prohibition. To the Branham family, having been involved with the Wathen liquor ring, this would have been a very appealing doctrinal position. For the prophet and the people of Jeffersonville, Roy Davis's highly publicized trial of sexual immorality and swindling church members was not a problem. Instead of hiding his past, Davis embraced it. He published a religious pamphlet entitled 10 Days in Federal Prison and started a revival. Davis began claiming to have been a licensed spiritualist who converted to Christianity and was about to expose the increasingly popular world of spiritualism. He did very well at presenting himself as a victim. So well, in fact, that he attracted former Jeffersonville Mayor Thomas B. Rader's son, Ralph Rader, to join him in hosting the revival. As a martyr, Davis was able to attract large crowds. The city of Jeffersonville quickly turned into a Pentecostal revival, and Davis transitioned from spiritualist to divine healer. This was confusing for me since the prophet claimed to have never heard of Pentecostalism before a trip to Mishawaka, Indiana, years later. Having joined forces with Davis, not only was he the prophet in a Pentecostal church based on divine healing, he was working with Davis as a minister, helping to teach it, while Roy Davis continued to be a familiar face in the court system. Within just 2 years, Reverend Roy E. Davis was filling newspapers. You could read about his criminal court cases, civil lawsuits, revival meetings, church announcements and services, and even the Pentecostal church baseball team. When I thought about the prophet's early ministry, I never really thought about baseball. Some message churches forbid children from playing baseball. The team was pretty good, too. Their victories were reported in the Louisville News. I started digging through every archive that I could find that described Roy Davis's Pentecostal church. In the early years, E.A. Seward was an elder. Eugene Seward would have worked closely with the prophet during this time. I learned that besides the prophet, George DeArk and C.E. Meyers were also elders. I thought to myself, those names sound familiar. I remembered the 1936 deed to the Billie Branham Pentecostal Tabernacle. When the prophet's church was established, E.A. Seward and George DeArk were trustees. The men Roy Davis had appointed were also administrators of the prophet's church. I began to wonder how many other men involved with Davis were working with the prophet. Hope Brumbach, the prophet's first wife, was also involved. She led the devotional meetings for Roy Davis's church. Dan Davis, Roy Davis's brother, remained involved with Roy's operations, but not in Jeffersonville. In every article I could find listing Roy Davis's Pentecostal Tabernacle, Dan's name never appeared. Instead, Dan started his own church on Mechanic Street, just a few blocks from Roy Davis's church. Roy's other brother, Halbert Davis, migrated to Jeffersonville and became a leader in Roy's church. I found it terribly strange that Dan remained separate in Jeffersonville, competing against his brothers for congregants while working with Roy to fund his operations in Louisville. Roy Davis continued to grow and to expand his operations. He started a local radio broadcast to reach listeners in Kentucky and southern Indiana. He also created evangelists, both male and female, to spread his gospel. On May 6, 1933, Roy Davis announced an upcoming revival. It would be held in a tent under the direction of a noted evangelist. And just a few days later, the prophet started his services in a tent on Pratt Street, just a few blocks away from the two Davis churches in Jeffersonville. There was a newspaper article that read, 14 converted. 14 conversions are recorded in a tent meeting conducted at 8th and Pratt Streets by Reverend William Branham. I tried to reconcile this with the history of the message that I was taught. The prophet said that hundreds were converted and baptized at that meeting in 1933, and that the newspapers described a light shining from the heaven. The way the prophet described the scene, he was the center of focus while crowds large enough to gain national media attention were present and listening to God speak from the heavens. Yet, in the narrative presented through the weekly editions of Jeffersonville and Louisville newspapers, the Davis brothers were the center of focus, and not for their religion so much as for their controversy. The largest crowd reported in any newspaper that I could find for the prophet's meetings was 14 converts, which was a far cry from the hundreds that he described in his life story accounts. He claimed that the Associated Press packed the story, yet not a single digital archive of any newspaper in any city had record of such a story. Shortly after his tent revivals, the prophet became part of the Pentecostal lineup in Jeffersonville newspapers' church announcements. Though his church building was not yet reported, the newspapers reported that the prophet had a congregation. The late Miss Baldwin was a member when the prophet preached her funeral. This fact I did not find surprising, since the prophet described preaching in other buildings during the early days of his ministry. The name of his church, however, was surprising. The first mention of the prophet's church in the newspapers in 1935 was listed as the Pentecostal Tabernacle. Jeffersonville newspapers listed the prophet's Pentecostal church on Penn Street, just a short distance from the other Pentecostal churches. The prophet's Pentecostal church was on Penn Street, Davis's Pentecostal church was on Mechanic Street, and Roy Davis's church was on Watt Street. Ralph Rader's Pentecostal church was at the nearby Armory. The newspapers did not even mention Roy Davis's brother Wilbur or his son Roy Jr., who were now also ministers in Jeffersonville. Likely, they were appointed as evangelists. There were so many Pentecostals in such a small town. I thought back to the 1931 article describing the outrageous situation when Roy took a large part of Ralph Rader's congregation. I began to wonder, was the plan to take the rest of Ralph Rader's congregation? There weren't that many Pentecostal converts during that era, especially in the small town of Jeffersonville. With all of these Pentecostal churches, there was certainly some competition. Were they trying to drive Ralph Rader out of town? Roy Davis continued to ordain ministers and evangelists from Jeffersonville until 1934. January 24, 1934 would be the last newspaper advertisement for Roy Davis. After this, things changed at a rapid pace. Dan Davis announced that he would be leaving indefinitely. Reverend T. Powell replaced Dan Davis as pastor at his church on Mechanic Street. Shortly after, Roy Davis's Pentecostal church burned, and the Prophet's Church was advertised on the corner of 8th and Penn Street, replacing Roy Davis's Pentecostal Baptist Church advertisements. I found it odd, after all of this, that the Prophet continued to speak highly of Davis for the rest of his life. I remembered a sermon in 1964 mentioning the fire that burnt down Davis's church. The Prophet said that he was Davis's assistant pastor at that time. If this was correct, it would mean that members of Branham's congregation, described by the newspapers, were also members of Roy E. Davis's church, and that the church was splitting due to growth. I found it even more odd that the Pentecostal Baptist Church was not listed again until December 1935. Reverend Joseph D. Freeman was listed as the pastor, not Davis. What happened to Roy E. Davis? Since Davis's trustees and elders were now part of the Prophet's Church, and the Prophet said that he was Davis's assistant pastor when the church burned, did this mean that the Billie Branham Pentecostal Tabernacle was actually Davis's church instead of the Prophet's? I was even more curious about the 1933 prophecies. If the Prophet was preaching for Davis as late as 1934, how did Davis influence the perception of these prophecies? It was time to dig even deeper into the building of the new church. I wanted to know why Reverend Roy E. Davis, his brothers, and his son, all ministers, suddenly left town. Most of all, I wanted to know why the Prophet changed the timeline to 1933. There was a very unexplainable transition that happened from 1935 to 1936, not 1933. Why did the building we held with such reverence on the corner of 8th and Penn Streets in Jeffersonville have a marker on the side of the building, added years later, that stated dedicated in 1933? It was time to examine the 1933 prophecies, and the one that I was most curious to examine was William Branham's prophecy of the egg-shaped automobile. It was a prophecy that I used as an example many times during my life when witnessing to other people. As an auto enthusiast, I was fully aware that the old vehicles were big and blocky. Today's cars and trucks are more aerodynamic. Though they weren't shaped exactly like an egg, they were more rounded when compared to the old cars from the 1920s and the 1930s.